Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast, where it's all about turning your job search into a slam dunk. Your host is Angela Copeland.
Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast. I'm your host, Angela Copeland. On the phone with me today, I have Erika Gable in Columbus, Ohio. Erika is the Executive Director of the Women's Small Business Accelerator. She brings over 17 years of experience with nonprofits and social enterprises. Erika, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I'm really excited to have you on the program. We're going to cover a really important and potentially sensitive topic, which is sexism at work. And I just want to be clear that my goal today is really to both enlighten and empower both men and women on this topic and to cover some issues on both sides of the fence. So anyway, I'm excited to chat with you. Well, you spoke this year at South by Southwest on the topic of See It, Hear It, Stop It, Fighting Sexism at Work. And I'm curious, what do you think is the biggest sort of misconception about this issue in the workplace?
Well, I think especially recently, what's become really popularized in a lot of mainstream media is this whole idea of sort of extreme levels of sexism, especially taking in the form of sexual assault. And so I think in some ways we think it's either this extreme version or it doesn't exist. Mm-hmm. And so for a very long time, it's existed in a latent form. So it's starting to come out a little bit more than it has in the past. But there are a lot of ways that it is embedded into the culture of an organization, which is a little bit different than how, let's say, an individual might act on a day-to-day basis. So I think a lot of it is uncovering what's really going on and making sure that the cultures and structures that we have in place can support people of all different backgrounds.
Yeah, that's true. Well, so you said, and that's such a good point, that it's either, we pictured in our minds to be at one extreme or another, but maybe there's a lot that's happening kind of in the middle, sort of in this gray area. Do you have any examples, like if we are not maybe on the receiving end of this issue, what are things that we might, or that other people might be experiencing that would fall into this category that might be less obvious?
Yeah, a lot of times it's based on these expectations of what someone should or should not be doing based on their gender, essentially. And so an example that happens a lot is if you picture yourself sitting around the table with team members or a boardroom or anything like that, typically there tends to be fewer women than men, not always. And a lot of times it tends to be very certain voices that dominate the conversation. And because we still have more men in leadership positions within a lot of our nonprofits and companies around the country, the men tend to be leading the meetings. And so a lot of times when a woman speaks up with a new idea or a point, a lot of times it's not heard. And so that's something that happens very frequently. And sort of the tough part of this is if you don't hear someone, it's hard to hear them. And so, a lot of times women that I know will echo each other. It's a very specific technique. So if I hear another woman make a really good point in a meat, I'll say something like, "Hey, Angela made a really great point. I think we should really consider it." And so having that extra voice adds some meat to the conversation. A lot of times it's even things like the woman in the office or one of the women in the office tends to be expected to greet guests when they come in or go get the group coffee or go pick up lunches or take notes. And that does not necessarily have to do with level or position, but it's something that is good to be more aware of, just be conscious of it, and to really be clear on what kinds of expectations we have when we're interacting with people, both men and women.
I totally agree. It's interesting you mentioned some of those expectations. I have experienced this before where I was on a team where everyone on the team had the same job, right? The exact same job. And I was the only woman. And somehow that team, I loved that team. They were just a great group of people, but they would ask me to do things like get cakes and plan lunches and plan parties and get gifts. And I remember this period of time where I just got this huge influx of like, within like a week or so, I was supposed to plan like 2 or 3 parties and get like 2 cakes and get a couple of gifts. And it was sort of during the holiday time, and it actually was it was really impeding on my ability to do my regular job.
Absolutely.
And I didn't mind helping at all, right? But at some point it was like, gosh, can we maybe divide this up? Because this is like kind of a lot for me to wrangle. And I don't know that anybody really thought about it, but for me it was really difficult to kind of not only have to take in those requests, but figure out how to handle that situation. Because it's really, it's tough, because you don't want to be the bad guy, I think.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the things that women tend to not want to say no. We tend to want to be pleasers and to please our bosses especially. And I don't know about you, but I tend to also think I can do anything, bring it on, pile it on, I'll figure it out, no problem. Versus saying, this is not in my job description. I'm happy to help. Let's see if we can have a team of people do it. Versus it falling all on you, and then come performance review time, your numbers aren't lining up because you had all this other stuff you were expected to do as well. So that happens a lot.
Mm-hmm. Well, I feel like people are talking about this issue more than normal, and maybe it's just me, but I feel like I'm seeing it on the news. I feel like I'm seeing it on social media. I feel like it's more in the forefront of our minds than normal. Do you think that's true, or maybe I'm just focused on it?
I do think it's true. It seems like a lot of that voice is coming from a younger generation, which is really fascinating. It seemed like, when I was growing up or when my parents were growing up, there were certain things that we just were not supposed to talk about or we weren't supposed to bring up. And now it seems like there's more of a collective voice, and so people don't feel so isolated in their organizations. That said, it still is a risk when you are at work and you choose to say something when something's going on. It's a risk of being treated poorly by your colleagues. It's a risk of getting a bad performance review or losing your job or anything like that. Most of us are at-will employees. And so it's not as if we have, a binding contract that keeps us on our job no matter what we say. So it's definitely something you have to weigh when you see something actually going on within an organization. But it does seem like there's some attention being brought to it, which is wonderful. And there's still a ways to go and a lot to get done. And as we know, just talking about it doesn't necessarily fix it, but at least it helps bring a little bit to light.
I think awareness is really important because I know when you say bring it to light, because I've talked to, I went to college with all men. I actually had 2 male roommates in college, which is maybe kind of unusual. And I've talked to lots of people who themselves, don't exhibit this behavior. And so they have a really hard time imagining that it's happening. And I think without the conversation, without the personal examples and sharing them, it's like we kind of miss it and it continues to go on. So I think there is a lot of value just in the conversation and the education of it.
Yes, the awareness is critical. It's sort of that business concept that what gets measured gets improved. It's the same thing. So yes, that absolutely has to start with that awareness piece. It's, there's a lot of conversation right now, especially around implicit bias. Knowing that we all have certain biases in order to survive, essentially, but trying to bring those to the forefront of our minds so we can at least make a conscious decision based on what information we're gathering and to not accidentally expect the one woman to go get coffee, for instance. So it's, a lot of it is that awareness, but then it's also saying, okay, now that we see what's happening, what do we do about it?
Mm-hmm. It's interesting you mentioned implicit bias. So you mean being aware of the biases that we may have that we may not think about. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, there's a whole line of study on it, but that's essentially, yeah.
Yeah, the thing it makes me think of sort of on the opposite side, right? You mentioned the coffee example. I had a job early on where my boss was actually really respectful of me, and he made this huge point that I was like never allowed to make copies or get coffee or anything like that. And I was very young, where you don't necessarily always have tons of value to add like yet. You don't have like a ton of experience. So sometimes people are like, we're going to have you make copies for us or help us organize things. And this boss said to me, you will never make copies. No one is allowed to ask you to make copies or any of these things. So it was almost like to the other extreme, but I think it was really positive. Like this person, I think, was very aware of the possibility of that kind of bias. And at the time, I just didn't think much of it other than, wow, what am I going to bring to the table here? But
that's great. It pushes in a different direction. That's
yeah,
great.
it pushed me to do real work. Like, honestly, I mean, honestly, so at a young age. But anyway, I mean, I'm kind of curious as it pertains to us talking about this issue more. I mean, do you think it's things like what happened with Mr. Weinstein that have brought it up? Or do you think are there other things happening? You mentioned it's a younger age group. Are there particular incidents that catch your attention, or is it something else?
I definitely think those more extreme cases of the sexual assault do bring it more to light, and so at least we're not necessarily talking about something that extreme, but because it's not that extreme, it makes it feel safer to talk about than it used to. I think a lot of it is also really grounded in the fact there are more statistics that are being talked about. So a lot of talk right now around pay equity. I mean, even just this past Monday, that federal appeals court ruled that employers cannot justify paying a woman less than a man doing similar work because of her salary history. That's huge. That's absolutely huge. And so you don't get stuck at a low salary just because your previous boss didn't pay you enough. It seems like a lot of things happening all at once. It's almost like this movement where different voices in different areas and in different areas of expertise are popping up all at once and really supporting each other. That's something we've been talking about here in Columbus, Ohio, a lot, is this pay equity issue. So the national average is that women earn 80 cents for every dollar earned by a man. But here in Columbus, or worse, it's 78 cents. To every dollar a man earns. And it's even worse for African American women, 63 cents for every dollar. And then Latino women, it's 54 cents for every dollar a man earns for doing similar work. So it's a big issue. And so I know there's a lot of numbers coming out that help make it very real for people, not just these one-off anecdotes saying, oh, yeah, I had a bad experience once. It's saying, no, there's something that is in our system that's set up to make it not equitable for women who, by the way, are half the population and who have our children and raise our children. And that's the whole next generation of people. So I think there's a lot of movement that's very positive, and sort of getting out of the old way of doing things just because they've always been done that way. So it's an exciting time.
I agree. And I have to share with you, I'm a little bummed out today as we're chatting because I actually had an issue yesterday that came up with regards to pay equity, and it has really caught me off guard. I'm sure you know, earlier this week, there was like a pay equality day. And I think the idea of it, right, is this is, and maybe you know the details. It's like, this is the day, I don't even know how to say it. Well, anyway, let's just say it's celebrating the idea that we should all be paid fairly. Okay. And, I thought to myself, I really feel like I should post something on social media kind of celebrating the fact that we're having this discussion and the fact that, we're acknowledging that this is going on. And I started looking, and the different articles on the topic some of them were sort of biased in one direction or another, the way they were written. And so I thought, well, let me see if I can find an image that I can share. So I found an image that just kind of represented this idea. And I put a really basic caption like, I'm so happy that we're all, that it's important that we all make the same amount of money or whatever, or that we're paid fairly, something really, simple. And I was totally shocked because the people on my social media now, I've lived all over the country, so I'm friends with people who are all different. They have different backgrounds. People started fighting with each other like for over 24 hours, just nonstop commenting at each other's throats, saying that this is not a real issue.
Wow.
And I was really disappointed. I actually, this morning, I deleted the post because I couldn't stand it anymore. And I think the problem is a lot of the folks were sharing that some of the factors that you can explain away the pay inequality issue, right? And I think you can maybe reduce the gap a little bit if you look at sort of the factors, but very often those factors are part of the problem, right? Those are things like men don't receive the same amount of parental leave that women receive. A lot of society issues. So anyway, I don't know if you're seeing the same thing where you are, but I was really sad to hear that people don't believe this is a real problem.
Yeah, I mean, the Equal Pay Day was April 10th. And essentially that is the day where women, on average in this country, it's how long we've had to work to make the equal amount that men have made in 2017.
Yes.
We had to work all of 2017 plus until April 10th in order to make what men just made in 2017. And it's worse for women of color. And I think a lot of it, as we're seeing in this country, of a lot of different issues, not just this, it's really polarizing our country. I think part of it is the more we're talking about difficult topics, the scarier it gets, and the more it challenges the way people see their reality and see their world. And so just sort of like the grief cycle, I mean, one of the first reactions when you're presented with information that doesn't fit your normal reality is to fight it, is to argue with it and say, no, that can't be true, because if it was true, then the way you think about the world is not accurate, and that's scary. So a lot of it is being able to find places to have safe conversations with people who see things differently. My husband and I talk about this at home all the time. It's a really, really big issue. And especially as we're raising our daughter, how do we have conversations with her in a world that is challenging and is scary and difficult? And so we purposefully try to talk with people who we know see things differently than we do, just so we can at least remind ourselves to get out of our bubble and know that there's lots of different perspectives. Mm-hmm. I mean, the more the statistics come out, it's hard to argue that away, right? I mean, a lot of it. So here in Columbus with the Women's Small Business Accelerator, we're a local nonprofit. We work with early to mid-stage women entrepreneurs. And of course, a lot of people say, well, why just women, right? Like, why don't you work with every early stage entrepreneur? And a lot of it is that the women that come to our programs are dealing with different challenges than men are. There are a lot of statistics that support issues such as, women entrepreneurs get smaller loans from banks than men do. They typically make a lot less revenue, mostly because they're not charging enough, they're not pricing their things aggressively enough, and a lot of it is, the system is set up to not support, women getting good senses of financing or having to have, different levels of credit score than men, and things that people don't think about and are slowly starting to talk about. It's a really big issue. So in some ways, if you can explain anything away, if you are impassioned enough to not stop and really look at the facts or listen to other people's perspectives, but it's going to come to a point where you just can't argue what's actually going on around you, right? I mean, everyone knows women. I mean, everyone has mothers. Everyone has, sisters or aunts or friends or cousins. And it's sort of saying, well, would you want the woman in your life that you care about to be treated fairly? I would think that people would say yes. I would hope that people would say yes. But if they're really stuck on wanting to just see things the way that they want to see things, then that's tough. I would hope that people would be at least open to having a constructive dialogue.
I agree. It's interesting. On the thread that I'm mentioning, both men and women were doubting these statistics. But, I think for me, I think what you said that's really important is listening to other people, listening to their experiences, talking to other people. I don't think, I tend to take a very middle of the road kind of approach on a lot of things because I think going to one extreme or another is maybe not always helpful. And like you said, talking with people who are different than you, it helps us to learn more. It helps us to grow. I think the truth on a lot of issues is probably somewhere in the middle. But it just, man, it just really, I couldn't believe it. It just really surprised me. So anyway, I wanted to mention that to you. It just turned out that we had this interesting timing and that we were talking today.
Yeah.
But anyway, back to the idea of just straight up sexism at work. I'm curious as to, from your perspective, I think a lot of people, if they are experiencing sexism at work, they're hesitant to talk about it. And you kind of mentioned that early on in our conversation today. Why do you think that is that people are hesitant to bring it up when it's happening?
I mean, I think first and foremost, it's scary. And who likes doing, scary things? It's a risk. And so a lot of times there's not a good process in place where employees can safely bring this up without threat of retribution, really. And so, and a lot of it is also if you bring it up to, even if you work in a big company, right, and there is a process and an HR department, and that's different than an incident that happened. A lot of times it's tough because the more you talk about it, the more you have to sort of relive the situation also. And no one wants to be seen as someone who's complaining or whining or anything like that. We want to be strong, empowered people and make smart decisions and be seen as such. And so it's hard when something isn't going right because you have to sort of pause and deal with it. And so, it's easy to brush something under the rug because it's like, oh, well, it wasn't a sexual assault. It wasn't this extreme thing. Like, I'll just deal with it. I don't want to make waves. I don't want my boss to get mad at me. So I'll just sort of keep dealing with it. But, one thing I've been thinking a lot about lately is this concept of people will treat you how you teach them and like how you let them. And it's up to each of us individually to draw that line and say, even if it's little things, say, you know what, I'm not taking any work phone calls after 6 p.m. Or, when I'm, working on this project, I'm going to close the door to my office and that's going to be okay. The world is not going to end. And so when something starts to go awry, it's up to us to set that precedent even for everybody else, because the more that embedded sexism continues to happen, other people see it and then other people think it's okay. And then it keeps happening. And so if we can take these small steps to say something, even if it's not in the moment, you don't have to confront something head on. There's lots of different tactics to successfully deal with something, but to say, this doesn't feel right. This doesn't seem right. Let me explore this further. Let me talk to some other people. Let me double check to make sure. And let's really make sure to get this resolved. Because a lot of times it might have been something accidental. It might have been something that wasn't malicious, but it was real and it happened. And the more we talk about it with people, it tends to be the more that other people have seen it as well. So it's important to at least figure out a way to discuss it, even if it's not a formal, disciplinary action.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. It's interesting. I have personally observed people who spoke up about this issue years ago and seen them be sort of relocated within the company or just kind of let go altogether. And so seeing that happen, I do think it makes you really hesitant to speak up. I know it's made me hesitant in the past, but I recently had a guest on the podcast. Her name is Margaret Heffernan, and she said something which I hadn't really thought about, which was she said the reason that we're so scared is that the only examples of speaking up are the ones where we see the person being disciplined. She said there's tons of examples of people who speak up and things get taken care of. You just never hear about that.
Absolutely.
And I was like, oh, wait a minute. That was,
Yeah.
I mean, so simple, but very encouraging. I think the other thing you just mentioned, you said, you can talk about it without having maybe disciplinary action involved. And I know, at least for me, tons of times when I have been on the receiving end of something like this, I think the person who was maybe treating me in a certain way, they didn't realize what they were doing. And sometimes they were actually trying to be polite to me. Or they thought that was what they were supposed to do. And I'm just curious, because this seems just kind of a disconnect where the person on the receiving end is having one experience and the person on the other side is completely unaware. Have you seen this? Does this seem like something that's happening?
Yeah, I think that kind of example happens a lot. And in some ways, anybody in any work situation has had that happen, even just with regular modes of communication, even if we're talking about a project that we're working on or things like that. But as we all know, the less you say about something that was, let's say, a miscommunication, the worse it gets, because then you bury it and embed it, and then, it starts to come out in weird other ways, and then the other person's confused, and it just spirals. So I'm a big, let's deal with something as soon as we can, and it's not comfortable, but a lot of times it is just a miscommunication. And so just sort of like a lot of difficult conversations, you frame it in a way of saying, hey, I know we're on a team together, and I know we're in this together. You focus on what, the big picture of why you're working together, but then you just really use a lot of I statements, saying, the other day when we were in this meeting, when you said X, Y, and Z, I felt this. Is that something that you realized? Or, you just you ask questions of the other person and then make I statements. And a lot of times, for 10 minutes, which seems like forever, it's really, really awkward. But then you get through it, and then it's a lot better, and it doesn't then come out, as I said, in other weird ways, and it doesn't affect your work. So, and if you're not comfortable talking to someone directly, you can talk to someone else and say, hey, this incident happened. Help me think through this and help me deal with it. And a lot of times just having an outside perspective can help you process it and figure out what the best way to resolve it is.
Totally. I completely agree. And I'm curious too, I have a personal example. I have a personal friend who is a man who, through talking with me, has started to think about this topic more. And he's someone that, really wants things to be equal and wants to, be the best person he can at work, essentially, to everyone, right? And he said to me, I don't see the sexism because I'm not participating, but I wonder if it's going on, and I wonder how to talk about it. I wonder, could I ask my coworkers who are women about their experience, or would that be inappropriate? And I'm just curious from your perspective, if there's someone, if we're listening and we're thinking, God, I want to talk about this and learn more about the other side and what the experience is, how can we bring it up?
That's a great question. And I know this is also something similar when we're talking about, racism or classism or anything like that, any of the isms, right? A lot of it is, at least in my experience, it works really well if you can have a very small group facilitated discussion. Sometimes it can happen in large groups, but if you want everyone to really have an active voice, it has to be smaller. I'd say under 10 people. And to have a neutral facilitator that can guide that discussion and to really pull out what they might hear someone saying but not saying, right? That has been incredibly beneficial in my experience. I did experience that a number of times in a lot of different work settings, and it's been great. Even I've had moments where I'm thinking, man, I didn't even think about that from that perspective, and it's really enlightening. And then, of course, the more you understand about someone else's perspective, the better your communication and your relationship goes, right? So that's a lot of it, and a lot of it is also asking questions. But it has to be in a safe environment. Going up to someone in a public space, and let's say like a kitchen where there's a lot of other people going around, standing around and doing stuff, and asking a personal question is probably not the best idea. But having something where they know why they're in a certain room or group or discussion, making it clear what the purpose is, making it clear why they're there, and making it a safe space. You're going to be able to pull out what's really going on, and then make it very clear that no matter what people say, there's going to be no retribution. It has to be confidential. It has to be personal, because that's the only way to really get to the truth underneath all of it, and not just sugarcoat it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It's interesting, kind of along these same lines. I have a close girlfriend who has a really young son who is, let me think, he's probably about 7, and he's Caucasian, and she has her PhD, and part of it has to do with sort of diversity. And she's had conversations with him where she has said, you are someone other people will listen to. And when you grow up and you're an adult and you have a job, it's really important that you stick up for other people when you see these things happening, because they may not get listened to, but you will. And so I'm curious, if we see something happening at work. I have a close friend who recently observed, it's a male who recently observed a male in his work treating a female really negatively in a way that he would not have treated another male. And he brought it up to me and said, how do you handle this? Like, neither of these people report to me. It's a very small thing that happened, but it's a kind of a big thing at the same time. What could we do to support other people if we observe this kind of behavior?
Yeah, that's a great question. Especially in the workplace, part of it will depend, one, on what happened, and two, what kind of relationship that individual has with what they observed, right? So in that scenario, or in that situation, that the man who was sort of the witness, if he had a relationship with that other man, it would be great if he would just sort of say, hey buddy, I saw you do X, Y, and Z. It seemed really harsh, and I think that really, put her down, or it made her really uncomfortable, or, hey, I thought maybe we could do this a little bit differently, or something like that. If he, knew the woman also, or even a little bit better, he could go to her and say, hey, I saw this. Would you feel comfortable with me talking to this guy, or would you feel comfortable with me going to the supervisor and getting a sense of what she would like? If he doesn't know either of them, I would probably go talk to their supervisor, or even my own, and to just sort of process the situation, or HR. And I know sometimes you don't want to go to HR because you don't want to make it official, but a lot of times you can just sort of talk about what was going on, say, hey, I'm starting to see this, and I want to make sure we have a really good work environment. What can we do to fix it? So, whenever there's something challenging in any way, shape, or form, especially with any of the isms, my big thing is trying to stay really focused on what the big picture is, like what the end goal is, and not get lost in sort of the petty weeds. And to say, hey, we are here to, run this company in an ethical and fair way, to, make our shareholders money. Or, I run a nonprofit, right? We're here to serve the women that we work with, to support the community and partner in the community. We're all here because of that. How do we make sure that we can all be our best in the situation and do it all together? Versus, she said, he said, that kind of thing. Which is easy to get caught up in the drama. I like to minimize the drama.
I like that. I really like the part where you recommended going to the person that was treated poorly, because I really, really like that, because even if nothing else happens and the offending person's behavior never changes, I think if you're the person who is on the receiving end, to know that there are other people out there who saw what you saw and who believe that you weren't treated well. Like, I just even think somebody acknowledging that to you it's so helpful. Like, I think it feels so much less isolating.
Absolutely. A lot of things that both men and women experience. It doesn't have to be a super big official deal. A lot of times, to your point, we just need someone to talk to know that we're not the only ones. To talk to know that we're not losing our minds. Just to really process that. I've been in jobs and in situations where something is happening, and sometimes it just takes, going out for happy hour or going out for lunch and just talking with someone about it, just to process it. And then at least I feel like I then have the tools and the knowledge to either address something or to really just deal with the situation, and to try to be my best in the situation.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So we've been talking about sexism a lot as it relates to women. But one thing I really like about the way you've been presenting all the information is that you're kind of comparing it to other situations about like how we set boundaries or other types of isms, essentially. And I'm curious, though, I highly doubt that sexism is a woman-only issue, that only women are dealing with this issue, or are on the receiving end. Do you also see it as there are men out there who are facing sexism as well?
Oh, absolutely. I think it tends to be most common, sort of the men are the instigators in the towards the women, but not always. Most of the work I do is with women, and so I see it even with between two women. And definitely, men can be on that negative receiving end as well. Now, if we get down to it, I think we mentioned this earlier. It's about, expectations that we have about other people based on their gender, or even, their gender identity. When we talk about people who are transgender, right? That's a lot of it, and or even sexual orientation or things like that. Even things like I hear people say situations like, "Oh, this is my gay male friend. He can help you with your fashion." Like, well, why would he suddenly know about fashion? He might, but just because of that wouldn't dictate that straight line. And so. Absolutely. And I would guess that it might even be harder for men to say something and speak up because it can be embarrassing. And I talked a little bit about this at South by Southwest during our panel presentation, but really underneath it all, the sexism is really about power. It's about power to control a situation and to make decisions. And so a lot of times, either people in a hierarchy at work or even someone who maybe doesn't have a lot of actual power try to use whatever they can to control a situation. And I don't mean necessarily it doesn't have to be a negative way, but even things like if you are interviewing a new candidate, and it's a group of men, you take the new candidate out for drinks at 8 p.m. on a Friday night in a low-lit bar. I talked to the woman recently who experienced that and tried to change the location of the meeting to something that was a boardroom or more professional. And basically, the men said, "No, this is where we do all of our meetings." And she went and was like, "Okay, let me see what I can do," and felt extremely, extremely uncomfortable, and because they had the power to choose the situation and control the environment. So all of us can be more aware of that, and to try to make it a place that's sort of safe and comfortable for everybody. We've all heard sort of the golden rule, where it's, treat somebody how you would want to be treated. And I think that's not quite right, actually. I think it's actually treat somebody how they want to be treated. And that takes a little bit more effort and a little bit more listening, but in the long run, it's going to be better for everybody.
Wow. That's such a good note to end on, I think. That's just perfect. Well, Erika, this has been excellent. If we want to learn more about you and your work, where should we go?
Yeah, you can feel free to go to our website. It's in transition. We're building a new one, but it's wsbaohio.org. That's the Women's Small Business Accelerator. You can follow us on Facebook or LinkedIn. And I also do work on the side. I consult with nonprofits, so that's Gable Consulting. .com as well. So, yeah, thanks a lot, Angela. This has been wonderful.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Erika, so much. This has been great. And, I'm so happy we were able to tackle a difficult topic today.
Yes, it's very intricate.
Yeah. And thanks, everyone, for listening. Thanks to those of you who sent me questions. You can send me your questions to Angela@CopelandCoaching.com. You can also send me questions via Twitter. I'm at Copeland Coach. And on Facebook, I'm Copeland Coaching. Don't forget to help me out. Subscribe on Apple Podcasts and leave me a review.
Thank you for listening to the Copeland Coaching Podcast today with your host, Angela Copeland. Tune in next time to get more great tips on turning your job search into a slam dunk.